think all these things advance, at the same time. The need to decarbonize, to diversify, to maintain energy sovereignty, to fight for independent unionism, all while trying to dismantle the decades of damage done by neoliberal energy reform.
I'm really excited to have international guests on the show because
Yeah.
international solidarity is really, really important right now. Something Jose mentioned about in his call was about an immigration rally, and I was honored to speak at the Alabama Coalition for Immigrant Justice and other groups organized a rally at the State House in Montgomery this past week, and I was honored to speak there as someone who is a unionist who believes that we must choose solidarity over bigotry, right? That is, to me, the path that we have to pick. We have to stick together as working people and not be divided by race or gender or, national origin or the language we speak. We may not all look the same. We may not all talk the same. But at the end of the day, most folks are working class people. Most people do not own capital. They have to work for a living. They have to, actually sell their labor. And that's what powers our economy. And so it's really important, I think, that working people have solidarity across national borders because what happens around the world does impact us. We've seen the way outsourcing has really been a problem here in the United States. A lot of manufacturing industries outsourced a lot of jobs over the last few decades to other countries. But we've also seen the way some of these free trade deals have also hurt those countries as well, right? Like NAFTA was devastating to the agricultural sector in Mexico and contributed to mass migration. And that's something else that I think we don't talk about a lot is why do so many people immigrate? Like, why is migration such a thing? And now migration's always been a part of human history. As long as we've been on this planet, we have moved around, right? So this idea that powerful people draw lines on a map and we're all going to stay within those confines is not realistic compared to the broad scope of human history. But we do have to wonder, why do so many people have to flee their homes, particularly in, Latin America, and, look for a better life elsewhere and take a really dangerous journey, take all kinds of risk to make it here, to live here, often in, pretty terrible conditions. It's not like things are all gravy when they get here. Typically they're working the worst jobs in some of the worst living conditions. And contrary to popular belief, they are not just given, massive amounts of welfare or anything like that. Once people arrive here immigrating, whatever, their path may be. But, that's something we don't think about is why is that a necessity for so many people? Because I think it's heartbreaking, really, that so many people do feel like they have to flee their home just to be able to take care of their families. Right. I don't think that should be necessary. And I mean, that's something that resonates with me as an Alabamian because I've often thought about leaving Alabama because I know the quality of life is better almost anywhere else in the United States. But I shouldn't have to leave my home to have a decent quality of life for me and my family. And, but that brings up questions of foreign policy, of free trade deals, the ways in which, United States policy has impacted these countries, typically in negative ways, and have driven people into these conditions, into the situation where they are willing to leave their home and uproot themselves and go to another country and risk all that entails. So, that's another conversation, but I do really think that it's just important that we as working people, we cannot give in to nationalism and xenophobia. And this has always been something that has plagued our labor movement. We've always had these internal divides in our movement. You can go back to the earliest days of the American Federation of Labor and the Knights of Labor, right, and debates about whether to include Asian immigrants and Mexican immigrants and things like that. Ultimately, our power is collective when working people stand together. Because we're facing, ultimately the same corporations and billionaires. It's really a handful of elites control the vast majority of the wealth in this world, and they don't necessarily respect the national borders in terms of where they seek profit, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to seek profit wherever they can, and so we have to stand together with other workers and support union organizing wherever we can. That's, I think, really important, that unions lift each other up across national borders, and that we collaborate and strategize together.
Absolutely. We do have on the line now Lala Peñaranda, the Latin American coordinator for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy out of Colombia. Lala, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks, comrades.
Can you talk to us about Trade Unions for Energy Democracy? What is the organization? What is your remit? Why were you formed? What kind of unions are involved? Just tell us about it.
Yeah, of course. TUED, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, is a network of about 130 unions in about 40 countries, and it was launched in 2012 at the Rio Plus 20 climate conference, when trade unions, primarily from the Global South, identified that many in the trade union movement and also in the climate spaces were excited at what was essentially a privatized to decarbonize agenda. There was a lot of talk about getting trade unions a seat at the table, and that this was going to be an economic boom, a capitalist boom, and that everything that was green was going to lead to jobs and economic growth. And many of the unions, again from the Global South at that time, said, the way that this is being phrased, we identify it as a kind of green structural adjustment proposal or approach to the climate crisis, which is very real. We do need a just transition, these trade unionists would say, but it's not enough to say no to the privatized to decarbonize agenda. It's not enough to say no to green capitalism and green growth. It's not enough to say no to the dismantling of the traditional energy unions for de-unionized renewable energy sectors. We need an alternative. We need an alternative that is coordinated, that is coherent, that is ambitious, and that has a vision, a political vision for our trade union international labor movement. And so TUED was born at that moment in 2012. It was born with about 15 unions, and we've grown to 130. TUED has essentially two pillars. The first is the defense of the public ownership of energy. And the second is the democratic control of that public ownership. So we know it's not enough to have public ownership, whether that is at the state level, municipal level, community level. It's not enough. We really need to make sure that these public companies are meeting their public mandate, are actually meeting the needs of the climate crisis, the working class, and workers. So that's TUED in a nutshell.
That sounds like a very, very needed sort of thing. And there's, capitalists act very similar in all countries in very many different aspects. And so it's funny that, we were just talking about, before we brought you on, about the U.S. Postal Service. And there are now, under the Trump administration, banks putting out reports literally just salivating at the idea of being able to cut this thing up for profit and privatizing the gains and socializing the losses. And that's a lot of what your unions have seen across the country as, countries are trying to kind of, transition into cleaner energy models. And it's something that in any transition, we've seen capitalists try to take advantage of crises to degrade working conditions and take money from working people. So it's really exciting seeing a bunch of unions from across the Global South get together to try to come up with a coordinated way to fight back. So, Lala, you were talking about TUED and kind of what y'all were about. Y'all had a conference that I was hoping to be able to make it to, but unfortunately I wasn't. But you had a conference in Mexico City in February. Can you talk to us about some of the highlights from the conference and what were some of the themes that were being discussed and what came out of those conversations?
Yeah, of course. So I guess let me backtrack a little bit and contextualize, why we had this meeting and the sort of how we got there. Within the TUED network, there's a platform that we launched 2 years ago called TUED South, and it's the Global South unions that form part of the TUED network. And we launched it because we recognized that the challenges that the Global South trade unions face were particular, specific, and very different from the challenges faced in the Global North. Now, of course, we need North-South solidarity. We need true internationalism, anti-capitalist internationalism in our labor movement. But we did get requests from trade unions in the Global South saying we want to develop our own analysis based on the realities on the ground. So we developed this TUED South platform, and it was essentially launched in Nairobi, Kenya, 2 years ago, and we've since had a few regional policy meetings. So the first one was in Johannesburg in South Africa for the African trade unions, and then we had the Latin American Caribbean here in Bogota, Colombia, and then we had the Asia Pacific region policy meeting in Jakarta and Bali, Indonesia. And the idea of those regional policy meetings was really to develop a kind of trade union-based policy agenda or common policy program of trade unions in the region to push forward what we call a public pathway approach to the just energy transition. So this public pathway is sort of what we've termed the alternative that we're trying to build, the alternative to this other green structural adjustment framework that unions are being pressured to accept around the world. So I think, we sort of gathered different working documents, different research initiatives throughout these 3 regional policy meetings. And the Mexico City meeting was the second inter-regional TUED South meeting. And so we had unions from all 3 regions of the Global South and then also Global North allies. And it's such a shame that we couldn't have you there because it would have been awesome. But maybe next time. And the overall objective of the Mexico City interregional meeting was to essentially report back on what has been built over the past 2 years in the TUED South platform. And so there were sort of regional report backs, and there were report backs on campaigns to reclaim and restore public energy. And then we also had some specific sort of goals. One was to report back on the creation of a network called Red Capu, Red Camino Público, or the Public Pathway Network, which is a Latin America-based initiative of research centers that are formally allied to trade unions, and who are doing, the research centers are doing research on what it would mean to build a public pathway in their respective energy sector and in their respective country. So really getting down to the kind of nitty gritty of what it means to build a public pathway in their countries, in their sectors. And again, these are research centers that are allied with trade unions. And so they have that confidence and that trust. Mm-hmm. And there's, anyway, Red Capu basically reported back their first document, their first sort of findings after a year of collective research. And before moving on to the next point, I'll just also say that, we are a very fragmented trade union movement, not just in Latin America, but because I'm the Latin America coordinator, I'll speak about that. It's incredible how many trade unions within a sector are not in communication with one another when they work with, similar class enemies. And the same was the case for research centers. So these are leftist, progressive, anti-capitalist research centers that work with trade unions and that really weren't in touch with one another. And so it's partly a product of also just like financing schemes and NGOs will ask a research center to produce a product, but it's not necessarily what is often most strategic for the trade union. And it kind of incentivizes, production of these reports rather than collaboration between centers. And so the initiative for RedCap was really to create, to not reinvent the wheel, but rather to build off of the experiences of one another, learn from one another's research, and create a collectively researched document. So that was one of the objectives. We did that, and RedCap was now working on other research initiatives, including what a public pathway would look like in the Amazon, and we're going to present that at the COP30. So that was one. The other was the launch of the Feminist Initiative for a Public Pathway. So recognizing that, of course, there's a lot of sexism and patriarchy in the trade union movement, and that it's our responsibility as a collective international labor movement to fight against it, and also to have political education in the energy sector in particular, for our compañeras, for our women trade union comrades. And so we launched this initiative first to highlight how the neoliberal feminist approach has failed working class women around the world, and how that energy model has burdened working class women around the world first and foremost, but also what the feminist approach within the trade union movement would look like. And so we're launching a series of political education sessions this year around that. That was the second. The third was a coal phase down task force for Asia Pacific. So we're starting with just trade unions and research centers in Indonesia and India. And the idea of that task force is to research, in this incredibly coal-dependent region, what would it look like to have a planned pro-public phase down of coal, not one that creates a kind of shock to the system and to many communities that over decades have developed, have been imposed a dependency on coal, but rather to really plan and ensure that it's just. And so that was the third. We also had a soft launch of TUED union support for oil, or for an energy embargo in solidarity with Palestine. So we're going to be meeting and contributing as unions to the call for this energy embargo, which is a campaign that already exists, and just sort of directing energy and prioritizing that as one of the most important internationalist struggles that unions are strategically positioned to actually, support. And as, for example, was the case with the coal workers union in Colombia, Sintra Carbón, Colombia being a country that prohibited the export of our coal to Israel under the administration of Gustavo Petro. And there are a few other initiatives, but I guess I'll just close with one more, which was the collective working. So before every regional policy meeting, we try to have a document that sort of gathers the analysis, the most recent analysis that the network has had. And for the interregional, for this meeting in Mexico City, we developed the document called Towards a New International Energy Order. So playing on the kind of, new international economic order, but focused on energy and what it means to have this sort of South-South collaboration around the just transition at a time when the global North is really facing through right-wing administrations in particular, a kind of abandonment of climate goals, which, just to be clear, we're not being met anyway, but they're being abandoned sort of in a really drastic and dramatic way, as we see obviously under Trump, but also many other countries in the global North. So what would it mean for the South to sort of reclaim agency, understanding that there are many structural challenges to financing and to, not becoming indebted in the process of actually building a just transition, but still not waiting on the global north to take this leadership. And so what would it mean to build that new international energy order that is so needed in this climate crisis? There were other initiatives that came out of this meeting, but I guess maybe we can talk about them later. I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, no, that all sounds so cool. And the more that I'm hearing about it, and the more that I've seen coming out of it from TUED, the more frustrating it is that I wasn't able to go, because it really does sound like a lot of different folks came together to agree on some path forward, some paths forward, and some plans of actions on some really important kind of things. And we have been on the Valley Labor Report, like very, very loosely tracking a few Central and South American countries, in particular Mexico, Bolivia, and Argentina. And those are some some very different situations right now. But the conference was held in Mexico City, and I saw that there was a workshop on the public pathway in Mexico, and obviously there is a lot of adoration for Morena and AMLO and Scheinbaum, particularly on the left in the United States, or the left of liberal space in the U.S. People kind of look longingly at Scheinbaum and say, if we had Bernie, this is what we could have had. We could have had a very strong, populist left movement. Obviously, if you go deep enough, there are criticisms, I think, of the AMLO administration. Scheinbaum's is still new, but what is the state of transitioning in Mexico, in particular, under now 6 going on 7 years of rule by Morena, AMLO, and Scheinbaum in Mexico?
Yeah. So. Yeah, as you mentioned, we decided to have this meeting in Mexico exactly because it's such a sort of important reference point to study in terms of the reclaiming and restoring of public energy. We had some government officials present at the meeting, and we had a session that went into sort of the case study of Mexico and what lessons can be learned from it. And as you said, sort of both good and bad challenges and opportunities. And then, yes, we had a post-interregional meeting conference just with the Mexican trade unions. And there, I think we had, it was the electrical transport, the electrical workers, the oil workers union, the engineers, water management, and, sort of those are the ones that are coming to mind. Cynthia, the automobile independent trade unions. I mean, I think when you talk about Mexico, it's always really important to remember that about 1% of the unionized workforce is in independent unions. And so these are independent as opposed to charro unions or corporate unions. And this is one of the really unfortunate sort of legacies of the lack of independence between trade unions and political parties in Mexico that, has led to this kind of tradition, really strong tradition of corporate unions. And so to work with independent unions, I think, is sort of to bet on the long-term fight of unionism in Mexico, where class consciousness is the first commitment, and then, internationalism and communities, and not, of course, your employer. And in Mexico, they had a very aggressive neoliberal reform of the energy sector under Felipe Calderón and Peña Nieto. And so now the initiative of trade unions and of the Cuarta Transformación, the 4T, or the Morena, both AMLO and Scheinbaum, is to recover some of what was privatized and neoliberalized. There are a lot of independent, autonomous sort of regulation bodies that, instead of like regulating for the public good, were regulating to favor the private sector in Mexico. And for the global south in particular, and for Mexico, energy sovereignty, I think, is one of the priorities. So yes, we need to decarbonize and diversify the energy matrix of Mexico, which is not particularly clean. But it cannot be at the cost of energy sovereignty. So it cannot be sort of by importing all energy. We have to, in Mexico, as the trade unions say, first have energy sovereignty, or not even first, and then in parallel, build out public renewable energies, which is what the Morena administrations have been doing with, in particular, solar energy. And, there's sort of a lot to say about the different initiatives that they've taken, but one was to fight what they called the balkanization of the grid. So with all the private actors, private sector actors sort of contributing to the grid, there were many blackouts prior to the AMLO administration, and even during the first years of the AMLO administration, because the grid was in chaos. It wasn't centrally planned. It wasn't sort of under a cohesive planning body. And so a lot of what they're doing now is to recover that the state's ability to plan and to centralize energy decisions and to provide maintenance to the grid. And so I think that's been one of the priorities, especially of the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the CFE. In the meantime, for unions to really fight for their labor rights in the process, and ISME, the Mexican Electrical Workers Union, has a historic process of trying to reinstitute the workers, the over 14,000 workers that were fired and that have been essentially on strike and in resistance for the past 14, 15, 16 years. And so, I think all these things advance, at the same time: the need to decarbonize, to diversify, to maintain energy sovereignty, to fight for independent unionism, all sort of while trying to dismantle the decades of damage done by neoliberal energy reform.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And so, one of the problems, one of the difficulties with getting worker buy-in for a just transition in the United States is the kind of recognition that workers have, even if they wouldn't put it in exactly the same way that I would, the recognition that workers have that capitalists are trying to take this opportunity to degrade working conditions. And so, you get a well-paid union oil worker in the United States, a well-paid union coal miner in the United States. They're generally pretty kind of antagonistic to the idea of, fighting climate change by moving to cleaner energy, moving to solar, wind, nuclear, things like that, because that's going to take away their jobs. And they don't have the confidence that there is a similar job waiting for them on the other side of a transition. And so what strategies is TUED and your affiliate or your involved unions taking to bring in workers like Ozzy, who was unable to join us today, but is the treasurer for the Oilfield Workers Union in Trinidad and Tobago? How do you bring unions like his into the fold and try to make plans for this transition in a worker-friendly way?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is that sort of retraining programs and early retirement and skills sharing are often talked about in really abstract, sort of we promise it down the line kinds of ways. And we think it's, really important to support sort of in-house trade union research on actually, like, in your territory, what kinds of jobs do trade unions want to have, are interested in having, have the skills to adopt. And I think, there are some studies that can happen on a kind of sort of sector level of, within the oil and gas sector, these jobs can be transferred to, or these skills can be transferred to these other jobs. But then there's the kind of on the ground reality. I'll just speak, for the case. Well, let me say first, we're, again, we defend public ownership of energy. So in the case of Aussie and the oil workers, or the OWTU of Trinidad and Tobago, they've had to constantly fight against privatization initiatives that promise efficiency and that you'd basically have a ton of layoffs for their sector. And to say, you cannot, in the name of a green transition, in the name of just transition, lay off these workers without a plan. So, first, we're maintaining our sector under public ownership, and two, we are, ready to strike and to take direct action to demand a plan. And I think demanding a plan is essentially that trade unions have to be the ones to have their own programs, like take the knowledge that workers themselves have incredibly seriously. And I think that I really can't sort of overemphasize this point enough, which is that a lot of global South countries are still depending on these absurd consultancies of like the McKinseys of the world, where when we have so much proper own knowledge of our sectors, of what can work, of how to maximize actual efficiency, and be creative in the ways that we kind of diversify in the short, medium, and long term. And so I think, for when we have progressive administrations like Gustavo Petro's, it's really important to give preference and prioritize the in-house knowledge and consultancies and program development for solutions that include workers, benefit communities. I think there's a lot to say about this point, but I guess I'll just talk about Colombia. So we have I guess maybe three main sectors: electricity, coal, and oil and gas. And in each of those sectors, there's different ways that workers are fighting for their future and for a sort of pro-public economy for Colombia. So, for example, the coal workers are facing imminent shutdown of many of the coal mines in Colombia. So these are mines that for decades have built, these are transnational, multinational, private companies that have operated across Colombia and that have imposed dependency on communities, which are, again, entirely dependent on the coal sector, whose local schools and soccer fields are named after the companies, et cetera. And so to not think about just like the shutdown of the mine and what to do with those workers, but to really think of it holistically as an ecosystem. And this ecosystem in Colombia, as in many countries, is sort of linked between different coal mines. And so you can talk about, as the Petro administration has done, a mining corridor for life. And so to say we need a policy that is that of like economic support and agrarian reform and sort of local economic development for this entire chain, and not just for the coal workers, but for their families, for their communities, for their neighborhoods, for their schools, and that's, I think, really one of the things that most moves trade unions. It's not just like the small sort of our jobs, which obviously is incredibly important, but even to dream even bigger and to say, actually, what kind of community do I want 40 years down the line for myself, but also for my children, for my grandchildren? What kind of economies do we want for our region? And so that's sort of the coal sector. And then there's also a fight to hold accountable these private multinational companies for the environmental disasters that they've left behind. And so there's a lot of sort of trade union fighting for justice and reparations in that sense, which has also really mobilized workers, because it's a fight also for recognition and resources to kind of be able to fight for environmental sustainability down the line. And then there's a lot to say. Maybe I'll just close in for the Oil Workers Union of Colombia, which recently changed their statute to be the Energy Workers of Colombia, and to work with Ecopetrol, the state-owned company of traditionally hydrocarbons, but now energy, which is 87% state-owned, to be the kind of leader for this transition. And so not to think of what will be the jobs that close in the hydrocarbon sector, but rather how can we ensure that this company that we work for and that we fought for and that we helped renationalize as USO, as the Unión Sindical Obrera de Colombia, to have Ecopetrol and USO workers lead the transition, to have public renewable energy, to have sort of the MIT of Colombia, publicly owned university for technological development, for research, to invest in petrochemicals and biofuels and sort of diversifying what Ecopetrol can produce. But really, again, defending jobs for sure, but then also thinking very ambitiously about what 10 demands sort of that everybody says that we're crazy for fighting for, can we win? And I think that's how workers stay engaged. That's how we've been fighting with unions. And there's different fronts. There's the workplace front. There's the sort of social movement coalition front, which is really important. There's constitutional court fights like the ones in Indonesia to keep the electric power sector public. So there's, I think there's lots of ways to sort of translate those dreams into concrete fights and to fight for the world that we deserve.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, so exciting, and I wish we had. We'll have to, obviously, you're going to have to get you back on. I mean, lots of really, really cool things, and I'm sure that you could spend an hour or two on any one of those topics that you just kind of briefly touched on. So maybe we can bring you on some other time to dive deeper into one of these things. But the keeping central the energy workers in like the decision making of their future, I think, is really, really important. And I think that there was a different future where the United States was also kind of in on that, where we had Wimpesinger leading the Machinists Union, we had Tony Mazzocchi leading the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, who were both fighting for Wimpesinger and the Machinists fighting for a just transition to a peace economy, while a lot of his members worked in defense, and Mazzocchi fighting for a just transition to a green energy economy, while most of his members were like oil field workers and stuff like that. And unfortunately, they were not as successful as they would have liked to have been. But really fascinating kind of pieces of history that are kind of playing out in other parts of the world right now, and hopefully we'll have a much better ending than Mazzocchi and Wimpesinger. So Lala, I guess as we're wrapping up here, is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that you left our audience with about what TUED is doing, or about any of the unions that you are involved with in the global South, and some of their stories? Anything that you want to make sure that you leave us with before we let you go?
Sure, yeah. And thanks again for having me on. And it's a shame Ozzy couldn't join us. I think he's in a labor council right now, and so he's fighting the good fight, and hopefully he'll be able to join at another time. I think it's also important to remind our comrades in the U.S. that whenever there is a just transition discussion in Colombia's labor unions, but also around the world, they do honor that history and say just transition cannot be co-opted. We cannot allow it to be co-opted, as unfortunately it has been. This is our term. Our comrades in the United States fought for this, and it is in our tradition to fight for it, to maintain, to keep it as a class-based struggle, a class struggle. And so I think, to just share that inspiration of U.S.-based workers still resonates and ignites workers around the world. And then to say that, how important it is to denaturalize this, the sort of profit-making element in the energy sector. I think when we're talking, if we take the climate crisis at face value, as urgent as it is, and the scale at which we need to very rapidly decarbonize, then we cannot responsibly, if we take the science seriously, leave this to the private sector. We cannot leave the equation to require profit making, profit maximizing. It is too important a fight. And so to remove profit and to inject sort of a public pathway approach to the just transition is kind of the task we're fighting. And we cannot do it without allies in every single corner of the world. And so the invitation is open. Doors are open in TUED for all comrades listening and interested to join TUED, to join the fight. And I think that, I'll leave it there.
All right. Lala Peñaranda, Latin and Caribbean coordinator for the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. Really appreciate your time. Maybe one day we'll be able to get you on. I told you over text that my aunt is from Colombia, and my uncle is very, very right wing, and so he was like, "Oh, Colombia, that's where the guerrillas have taken over, and it's all real terrible." So maybe we can have you sometime to just talk about how scary it is living under guerrilla rule in Colombia.
I'd love to talk about that. Yeah.
Fantastic, Lala. Really appreciate your time, and look forward to having you on again.
Thanks, comrade. Ciao.
All right. All right, 844-899-TVLR is the phone number, 844-899-8857. If you would like to call in, really enjoyed that conversation, and absolutely going to have to get her back on, and maybe some other TUED folks. Sounds like they're doing some really cool stuff.
Yeah, love to hear unions collaborating and working together, because something she said earlier in the conversation really stuck with me, which was that a lot of these unions, even in the same sectors, or even a lot of these research outfits doing a lot of aligned work, aren't collaborating, aren't talking to each other, aren't strategizing together. And, that's something you and I talk about all the time in terms of the labor movement down here in the South.
It really
in the
is.
American South, we deal with this a lot, right?
Yes.
There are folks within the same unions that aren't talking to each other. There are unions in the same cities and regions that aren't communicating and collaborating. We talk about the labor movement, but in a lot of ways, if you just dropped an outside observer to really analyze it and look at it, a lot of people would have a hard time saying this is like a cohesive movement. Right. And, instead it feels like just a lot of sort of scattered institutions that obviously have similarities and similar struggles and similar issues, but aren't necessarily all pulling in the same direction, aren't necessarily in dialogue with each other. So, I think that's really exciting, the kind of work that they're doing to bring these unions together, these workers together. And something that really did also resonate with me in that conversation towards the end was that we cannot abandon our climate and our future to profit maximization, right? And that is sort of the choice that we're faced with. Are we going to defend our future, the future of this planet, our environment, our climate, our habitat and ecosystem, our ability to just live regular, decent lives?
Right.
Are we going to abandon that in the pursuit of short-term profits? That is really a big question that we're facing. I think, getting the unions involved in the conversation and how to do this and how to transition, how to protect workers, because you're right, a lot of people are skeptical. They hear things like Green New Deal and, they're very skeptical that it's actually going to pan out. And we know for a fact that many of the so-called green industries that we do have in the United States, many of them are non-union. Many of them are paying lower wages. Many of them are paying worse benefits. That is a real problem that we have. And so, of course, the solution is workers organizing and organizing in these industries. And so I think that is a big opportunity we have. And I hope that a lot of our labor unions are taking that seriously. How can we organize in these new sectors? How can we both drive the conversation and the planning on these new jobs, but as these new jobs come to fruition, we have to be organizing these workers to really make sure that we have a seat at the table, and that this happens in a way that uplifts working people and doesn't just, make a few people more money.
Yeah. We have a caller on the line. This caller doesn't look like they've ever called in before. So we got a new caller, 786 area code, 786 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, my name's Jose from Miami, Florida.
Jose from Miami, Florida. A different Jose. Thanks for calling in. What's on your mind?
I really wanted to kind of piggyback off of what was just said about, unions being siloed. In Miami being one of the most individualistic and capitalistic cities, I would argue, in the nation right now, my neighbors are very much siloed. No one talks to each other. Even our union as well, the United Teachers of Dade, they are very much siloed. They don't talk to like the Pinellas County Teachers Association or any other like union in our state either. So I think that's a very, very good point. And I think that is true that unions really should work together, try to start having members talk to one another. And if the leadership isn't willing to do that or isn't willing to invest in that for whatever reason, I think it should be us, the rank and file, that are trying to reach across the aisle, that are trying to reach across, these borders that are really imaginary. So I just wanted to say that I highly agree, and that's something that I'll be taking back to my caucus. And thanks so much for the show, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, Jose from Florida. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for what you do as an educator, as a former educator. My heart goes out to you, and thanks for what you're doing in your union. Would encourage you and anyone listening to get involved in their local labor council, because those are institutions which, at least theoretically, are kind of set up to do this sort of thing, right? The idea is to get the different unions all in the same room, in the same organization, to have dialogue, to collaborate, to have common organizing plans, to have common communications plans, to really strategize together and build power together in a particular region. And, I think a lot of the local labor councils, the regional labor councils, CLCs, whatever, area foundation or federation, whatever they're called in your region, a lot of them need work. A lot of them need revitalization, needs new energy. And I think those are really critical institutions to rebuilding this movement and making it more of a movement, because, and it's tough because a lot of locals are just sort of scraping by, right? There are a lot of unions out there who are just kind of holding on for dear life. They're trying to protect the membership that they have. They're trying to hold on to the contracts that they have. They're dealing with right to work situation. So there's a lot of obstacles, I think, to that collaboration. Even those who are coming at it in good faith and would like to do so, right? There's a lot of difficulties in it. But what you said, Jose, really, really resonates in terms of rank and file workers leading the way to do that. We don't have to wait on our local president. We don't have to wait on our state federation president. We don't have to wait on these individuals. We as working people can start to build those relationships and grow that network and get more people involved. And, by doing so can kind of lead by example and hopefully push our leadership to move in the right direction as well. And, when that can't happen, that's when you run for office yourself. And I really encourage folks who are listening to consider running for union office, consider getting involved in your local or your state federation or your local labor council, whatever makes sense for you. But, find a role for you where you can get involved and can lead by example and make a difference. And in a lot of areas, it's as simple as just showing up, honestly. In some places, obviously, there are very, very competitive internal elections and entrenched leaders and things like that. But there's a lot of space out there for folks. If you're willing to show up, if you're willing to talk to people and have one-on-one conversations, and if you're willing to do the work, there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I would just encourage people listening to think about what you can do. Not everyone has to be an organizer. Not everyone has to be a media person, right? Whatever your skill set, whatever your talents, there's something that you can contribute to building a stronger, more democratic, more diverse labor movement that really is representative of the broad working class, because that's how we're going to actually fix these problems that we talk about every week, right? Whether it's billionaires dominating our government, oppressive laws that are targeting us for our speech and our freedom of assembly, the climate crisis, you could go on down the list. All of these issues, we need people power to resolve. We can't just wait around on the politicians and the billionaires to do right by us.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear if you look around, that's not the solution. The solution is people power. That's how we made progress in this country and in this state. Alabama in the South has had a lot of struggles, and it was ordinary people standing up, standing together, coming across, these lines that divide us and working to actually make positive change. That kind of massive people power, that kind of social movement energy that we had in this country in the 30s with the labor resurgence, in the 50s and the 60s with the civil rights and racial justice movements. We need that kind of energy again.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.